We've been talking a lot about the traditional plot structure and the traditional plot structure diagram, and this is the diagram that you've gotten used to seeing. It looks kind of like a mountain. It goes up and then back down again. It includes an exposition, a rising action, climax, falling action on the other side, and then a resolution. And this is the basic structure that everybody knows. But last year I figured that my students could probably come up with a better way of explaining what plot looks like to them, and so I asked them to come up with an alternative plot structure diagram that would make sense. I want to show you a few examples because you're going to be making one of these alternate plot structure diagrams in a few days. Here's one example that was made by two 8th grade boys football players last year, and they decided that the plot structure reminded them of a football throw in a game. So the first thing they did was at the bottom of the throw, the arch, they said that was the exposition. Notice that they put the definitions below exposition, introduces the setting and the characters, reveals the conflict or sets the stage for it. Now they did the first part of the exposition. They said Ryan's the quarterback and Colin is the wide receiver. So it introduces the characters. But it doesn't do anything to introduce the setting or the conflict. So make sure that whenever you're doing your example that your exposition shows all three of those things. What's at stake for the characters? Where are the characters? As the ball rises into the air, they called that the rising action. And their example for the sentence was Ryan sees Colin down the field. The rising action, in their definition, they said it introduces obstacles that make the conflict more complicated and builds suspense as the plot thickens. Now to me that doesn't seem like a sentence that thickens the plot in any way. Although if you've played football you probably know that whenever you see your receiver down the field and you're about to make that throw, that it can build some suspense. They could have spent a little bit more time building the tension, even though it's a small story. At the height of the throw, they labeled that the climax. It's the turning point in the story, and it presents the conflict at its most intense and dramatic. The ball flies through the air toward Colin. I like this use of climax and this point in the story being labeled as climax because many people think that climax is when the receiver actually catches the ball and everyone is cheering and happy and excited. It's a very exciting moment, yes. But the climax is the turning point, meaning that it could go in either direction. It could either be dropped or he could catch it. So whenever the ball is flying through the air and you're holding your breath waiting to see what happens, that's the actual climax of the story. As the ball starts to come down, Colin is about to catch the ball. These boys are really stretching out the conflict, trying to make it as intense as possible before we actually find out if he catches the ball. It's actually okay to resolve your conflict in the falling action. Usually that's when it happens. But it's fine to save it for the resolution. And finally, for their resolution, they said that Colin catches the ball. And under resolution it says resolves the story's final outcome and ties up any loose ends, which is a little vague. But usually in resolutions you kind of figure out how the characters feel about the experience and it gives some theme or idea about life that's important and that the story's author wanted to share with you. So that's our first example of a plot structure, an alternate plot structure. I like it because it flies up into the air like our traditional plot structure and then it comes down just like our traditional plot structure. And it's something they could relate to, football. The second example is probably my favorite example of the three because I think it does everything very, very well. They used the example of a roller coaster, and I think it fits because you go up the loop and then back down the loop, just like a traditional plot structure. So let's start with their exposition. Same thing, they labeled the exposition, but then they said, 3 friends decide to go on the Super Duper Looper at Hershey Park. So we have the characters, it's 3 friends. We have the setting, Hershey Park, and we have the conflict, what they are deciding to do to go on the Super Duper Looper. As we go up the loop to rising action, they said the friends got on and waited for the ride to start. As the ride started, they became anxious as it approached the huge loop. I like this conflict because it's an internal conflict. A lot of times when we think of conflict, you think someone getting in a fight or having an argument, but having anxiety about getting on a ride is a really good example of conflict. At the very top of the loop, they moved to climax. With their hearts were beating quickly as they shot around the loop. That's a great example, because anytime your hearts are beating very quickly, you get the feeling that you don't know which way it's going to go. You don't know what the outcome of the story is going to be. Just like our football story. We don't know if he's going to catch it or if he's going to drop it. Like in a loop. You don't know if you're going to make it around the loop or you're going to die a horrible death. So the climax is the turning point of the story, and their hearts are racing. In the following action, as they come back down around the loop, says they screamed loudly through all the twists and turns, and the ride soon came to a stop. So he tells us how the story ended up happening. As we would have expected, they'd made it all the way around the loop, and they're good, and it was fun. So the resolution of the story was it was fun, but they were glad it was over. Like I said in the last example, resolutions usually tie up all the loose ends like that, saying it was fun, and then it gives it some kind of further idea. They were glad that it was over. It tells you how the characters feel about their experience. So this is a really good example of an alternate plot structure, and the story that goes along with it, I think, is an excellent, short example of a narrowed down plot. The final example I'm going to show you is actually a good example too. It is a wave, and I think that it almost mirrors perfectly the traditional plot structure, except it's a lot more colorful. So I'm just going to walk you through their story, point out some good things, some bad things. In the exposition, they say, Sally is a California girl. She loves to surf. Her dream is to win the Malibu surfing competition. She is recently in training. So we have a character. We know that she's from California, and she loves to surf. And her dream actually becomes the introduction to the conflict, because we all know as we pursue our dreams, we sometimes run into obstacles along the way. And Sally does run into more obstacles as the rising action happens. Their example, Sally takes her board and paddles out into the ocean. She sees a huge wave and goes after it, then suddenly she hears a crack. Now, between the rising action and the climax, they decided instead of just having one conflict, they would actually have two conflicts, make things more complicated. So not only does Sally hear the threatening crack, but then something hit her board and cracked it. You can kind of guess that. She tried to stay calm and breathe, but then she saw a fin in the water. It was a shark. It was coming right at her. So the conflict gets a little bit more intense, but we still don't know which way the story is going to go. Is Sally going to get eaten by the shark, or is Sally going to be okay? It's a turning point because we don't know which way, but we're still at our most intense moment, where we're holding our breath, waiting to see what happens. In the following action, the girl said, Sally stayed still in the water. She was trying to remember what she saw on Discovery Channel, but before she could think of anything, the shark passed her. So notice that they resolved their conflict in the following action. They told us what happened. So now all that's left is to resolve Sally's story by saying how she felt about the whole situation. And for this particular story, they say, Sally swam back to shore and ran to her house. Then she promised her parents she would be more careful next time. Perfect resolution, because this one gives us a theme, to be more careful in the water. So another really good example of an alternate plot structure. So in case you haven't picked up on it, some of your requirements for this project are going to be that you create an alternate plot structure diagram. It could be anything that interests you. Football, roller coasters, waves, anything that goes up and then could possibly come back down. After you figure out what your plot structure diagram is going to be, you're going to label the parts of the plot structure, define them, and then you're going to write a mini story just like these folks did, mirroring the plot structure exactly, but in miniature form. So you can work in a group of 2 to 3 to complete this project. Good luck.